Tonight, somewhere in the dark water between Oman and Iran, another convoy of tankers is threading its way through one of the most fought-over stretches of ocean on the planet. It's August 21st, 2026, and this has become almost routine now. Routine in the way that anything can become routine once it happens enough times. Even something as strange as running loaded oil tankers past the coast of a country the United States has been at war with since the end of February. To understand why this is happening and what it actually tells us, we need to back up and look at the whole picture, not just the highlight reel. This war didn't start last night, and it didn't start with a single dramatic strike. It started on February 28th, 2026, when the United States and Israel launched a coordinated campaign against Iranian military targets, a campaign that included the killing of Iran's supreme leader, Ali Khamenei. That single act reshaped the entire conflict. In the weeks that followed, Iran responded the way a country backed into a corner often does, by reaching for the one piece of geography that gives it real leverage over the rest of the world. The Strait of Hormuz is only about 21 miles wide at its narrowest point, and yet before this war, something like a quarter of all the oil moved by sea on this planet, and a fifth of the world's liquefied natural gas, passed through that gap. Iran knows exactly what that number means, and so does everyone who buys or sells energy for a living. So, Iran declared that ships could not transit the strait without its permission, started boarding and attacking vessels it considered non-compliant, and even laid sea mines. Shipping companies did what shipping companies do when their multi-million-dollar vessels and their crews are put in danger. They simply stopped sending ships through. Traffic collapsed. The United States answered in April with a naval blockade of Iran's own ports, an aerial campaign meant to grind down the Iranian assets that were enforcing the closure, and eventually a ceasefire in the spring that briefly quieted things down. A memorandum of understanding was signed in June, giving both sides 60 days to work toward an actual deal. But that clock ran out without much progress. And by July, Iranian forces were back to attacking commercial ships they judged to be violating their rules. So here we are in the third week of August, and the fighting, in one form or another, has been going on for nearly 6 months. Now here's where the story gets more interesting and more complicated than a lot of the online commentary about it lets on. Over the past 2 months, the U.S. military has organized something that functions like a controlled bypass of the main danger zone, a route that hugs the Omani coastline along the southern side of the strait, away from the Iranian shoreline where most of the attacks have originated. Tankers move through it mostly at night, in coordinated groups, with Air Force fighters flying cover overhead the entire way. According to U.S. officials who've spoken to reporters, American strikes over a sustained campaign in recent weeks did real damage to Iran's coastal radar and surveillance capability along that southern corridor, degrading its ability to detect and target shipping in that specific lane. That's a real and significant operational achievement, and it's worth taking seriously rather than dismissing. Central Command itself has put out the numbers, and they're worth repeating accurately rather than rounding them up for effect. As of this past week, the military says it has helped move more than 660 million barrels of crude oil through the strait since early May, and assisted roughly 1,300 commercial vessels along the way. On the busiest nights, volumes moving through that southern lane have reportedly reached 15 to 20 million barrels. That is genuinely a lot of oil. But, and this is the part that tends to get lost when a story like this gets simplified into good guys versus bad guys, those numbers still represent something closer to half, not all, of what used to move through Hormuz before the war began. Pre-war traffic was somewhere around 20 million barrels a day on a sustained basis, not just on a good night. Recent tracking from UKMTO, the maritime security body that monitors this waterway, showed total shipping traffic sitting at a small fraction of pre-war levels just a few weeks ago, with only a slight improvement since. In other words, the strait isn't back to normal. It's been partially and carefully reopened along one specific, heavily defended route, while the wider picture of commercial shipping through the region remains badly depressed. And it hasn't been bloodless or risk-free even along the routes that are running. In July and August alone, at least 17 commercial ships came under attack in and around the strait, according to the International Maritime Organization, the United Nations body that tracks this kind of thing. At least 4 sailors have died in those attacks, and more than a dozen others were injured. The UAE's state oil company, ADNOC, had multiple vessels struck within a span of 48 hours, and the UAE's government accused Iran's Revolutionary Guard of using the strait as, in their words, a tool of economic coercion and blackmail. Iran, for its part, has publicly claimed responsibility for some of these attacks, while simultaneously warning other ships away from the strait altogether, insisting, as it has said, without much historical precedent, every week since this began, that no vessel may transit without its permission. So when you hear one side say the strait is under complete American control, and the other side say it's still Iranian sovereign water that nobody crosses without asking, both of those are propaganda, in the sense that both are simplifications of an ugly, contested, and only partially resolved situation. The honest answer sits somewhere in between. The U.S. has built and is defending a functioning corridor through the most contested waters in the region, at real cost, while Iran has lost a great deal of its ability to interdict shipping there, but has not been fully locked out, and continues to strike where it still can. It's worth talking about the hardware involved, because it is genuinely impressive engineering, even if some of the framing you'll see online overstates how magical it all is. The F-16 Fighting Falcon has been a workhorse of this air campaign, and Central Command has released footage of Vipers carrying APKWS pods. That's the Advanced Precision Kill Weapon System, a 70mm rocket with a laser guidance kit bolted onto an otherwise unguided airframe. It's not new technology dressed up as something revolutionary. It's a genuinely clever, cost-effective answer to a specific problem, which is the proliferation of cheap Iranian one-way attack drones, the Shahed family and its relatives. An Iranian drone like that costs somewhere in the neighborhood of $20,000 to $25,000 to build. An APKWS rocket used to shoot it down runs somewhere around $20,000 to $30,000, depending on the contract and the day. Compare that to an AIM-120 AMRAAM, a radar-guided air-to-air missile that costs north of $1 million, or an AGM-88 anti-radiation missile in the hundreds of thousands, and you start to understand why the Pentagon has leaned so heavily on APKWS for this specific mission. When you're fighting a war of attrition against cheap, disposable drones, you cannot afford to keep answering $25,000 problems with $1 million solutions. That math doesn't hold up over months of sustained operations. And the fact that American planners recognized that and adapted is a legitimate point in favor of how this specific piece of the campaign has been run. Aerial refueling has also been a quiet backbone of the whole operation. KC-135 Stratotankers, some of the oldest airframes still flying in the Air Force inventory, working alongside the newer KC-46 Pegasus tankers to keep fighters on station over the Gulf of Oman for extended patrols. Reconnaissance has come from assets like the RQ-4 Global Hawk, a long-endurance drone that can loiter at high altitude and sweep enormous areas of ocean, feeding what it sees down to fighters and to Navy Aegis-equipped destroyers, which link everything together into a shared picture. That kind of networked situational awareness, where an F-16 pilot effectively has access to what a Growler electronic warfare aircraft sees, and what a destroyer's radar picks up, is a real and meaningful capability. It's the product of decades of investment in what the military calls sensor fusion, and it's a large part of why the Southern Corridor has been able to function at all. There's also a human cost to this deployment that rarely makes it into the celebratory version of this story, and it deserves to be said plainly. The USS Abraham Lincoln has been at sea for an extraordinarily long stretch. Deployed since November of last year, and as of this week, logging more than 260 days underway, over 200 of them inside an active combat zone, with more than 10,000 aircraft sorties flown and well over 500,000 pounds of ordnance expended. That is an extreme operational tempo, and it has come with a real toll on the people doing it. There have been reports of worsening mental health conditions among the crew, concerns serious enough that they've drawn attention from lawmakers and military families back home, and at least one sailor went overboard earlier this month. This week, the George Washington Carrier Strike Group finally arrived in the region to begin relieving the Lincoln, which will now start its long journey home. A journey that, because of the sheer distance and the demands of the mission, could still take a month or more. None of that undercuts the technical achievements of the campaign, but it's a reminder that behind every clean phrase like sustained operations and controlling the southern lane, there are thousands of actual sailors and airmen who have been living this deployment in real time far longer than anyone originally planned, and that cost is part of the honest accounting of this war too. Now, about that Iranian tanker that got boarded this week, the story is real, but it's not quite the story some corners of the internet are telling. A tanker sailing under a false identity, widely believed to be part of Iran's so-called shadow fleet, the network of vessels that use flag hopping, name changes, and murky ownership structures to move sanctioned Iranian oil around the world despite U.S. Treasury sanctions, was seized this week roughly 136 nautical miles off the coast of Yemen by 6 armed men who took control of the ship and diverted it towards Somalia. That much is confirmed by the UK Maritime Trade Operations Center and reported widely. But here's the context that matters. This was not an isolated, mysteriously convenient incident. It was at least the 13th ship attacked off Somalia, or in the Gulf of Aden so far this year, compared to only 5 such attacks in all of last year. Somali piracy, which had been almost entirely stamped out by international naval patrols for the better part of a decade, has come roaring back in 2026, and maritime security analysts have a fairly mundane, unglamorous explanation for why. Oil prices have climbed because of the war, which makes tankers more valuable and more tempting targets. And at the same time, the naval assets that used to patrol these waters specifically to suppress piracy have been pulled away, redirected to the Strait of Hormuz and the Red Sea to deal with the Iran war and Houthi threats instead. Fewer patrols plus more valuable cargo equals more piracy. It's really that simple. Reading a coordinated intelligence operation into it, rather than a resurgence of an old and well-understood criminal problem exploiting a security gap, isn't supported by what maritime security researchers are actually saying. If anything, the more sobering point is that this war has created a vacuum that criminal networks elsewhere are now taking advantage of, a side effect that doesn't get much airtime in the version of this story built for maximum drama. On the economic pressure side of things, there's a real and escalating campaign underway, separate from the ships and the airstrikes. The U.S. Treasury has been expanding sanctions, most notably a sweeping action last December that targeted nearly 30 Shadow Fleet vessels, and the shipping management companies behind them, aimed at cutting off the financial pipeline that lets Iran keep selling oil despite the restrictions. This week brought fresh sanctions targeting Hezbollah as well, part of a broader pressure campaign. President Trump has publicly warned that any country offering Iran what he called an economic lifeline would face what he described as an economic D-Day. And Treasury officials have talked about pairing the naval blockade with what they've called the toughest sanctions regime in the relationship's history, with additional details reportedly expected in the days ahead. Whether that pressure campaign ultimately forces Iran back to serious negotiations, or just deepens the humanitarian and economic strain on ordinary Iranians while the regime digs in, is genuinely an open question, and reasonable people who follow this closely disagree about which outcome is more likely. It's also worth being precise about a claim that's been circulating, that the Keystone XL pipeline has been reopened and is now flowing oil. That's not quite accurate, at least not yet. What actually happened is that President Trump, in the middle of trade negotiations with Canada over a new round of steep tariffs, posted on social media that the pipeline project, killed off years ago, may be awoken from the grave, using it as a bargaining chip to pause 50% tariffs on Canadian goods while the two sides work out a broader deal. Canada hasn't confirmed any details, and the company that owns the relevant infrastructure, South Bow, has said only that it's in the early stages of stakeholder engagement, cost planning, and financing review, with a final investment decision not expected until sometime next year. There is a related smaller project, sometimes called the Prairie Connector, that would repurpose roughly 150 kilometers of pipe that was already sitting in the ground from the original Keystone XL effort, connecting to a separate line into Wyoming. That project has received some binding customer commitments and does represent real, if modest, momentum. But as of this week, no new oil is flowing anywhere because of this announcement. It's a negotiating tactic wrapped in a nostalgic headline, not an operational fact on the ground, and it's worth being honest about that distinction rather than presenting a social media tease as if barrels were already moving. So where does that leave the bigger picture? Iran built its entire wartime strategy around one piece of geography, and the fear that its ability to threaten global oil supply through Hormuz would give it outsized leverage over the rest of the world. Over the past several months, the United States has worked methodically to take pieces of that leverage away, not through a single knockout blow, but through a layered approach. A sustained air campaign against the coastal radar and drone infrastructure that let Iran contest that southern shipping lane, a standing naval blockade and escort operation that keeps oil moving even under threat, an expanding sanctions regime aimed at Iran's shadow fleet and its remaining trade partners, and a broader push to diversify where the world's oil comes from in the first place. From renewed interest in North American pipeline capacity to increased flows from other suppliers. Each of those pieces, taken alone, is incremental. Taken together, they represent a real effort to make the Strait of Hormuz less of an economic chokehold than it used to be. But it would be a mistake to describe Iran as having simply lost, or to describe this as a clean, low-cost American success story, because the numbers don't fully support either extreme. Shipping through the strait, even with the new southern corridor running at full capacity some nights, is still well below where it stood before the war. Attacks on commercial vessels have continued through the summer. Sailors have died, and cargo has been damaged or lost. The crew of at least one American aircraft carrier has endured one of the longest and most grueling deployments in recent memory, with real consequences for their well-being. A wave of piracy has reopened in the waters off Somalia and Yemen, a side effect of naval resources being stretched thin across multiple crises at once. And Iran, for all its degraded capability, has not stopped fighting, has not backed down publicly, and continues to insist, rightly or wrongly, and it's genuinely difficult from the outside to know how much of that insistence is real conviction versus propaganda for a domestic audience, that it still controls the waterway on its own terms. What we're really watching is a slow, grinding contest over the value of a choke point, played out through radar jamming and laser-guided rockets and tanker convoys in the dead of night, but also through sanctions packages and pipeline announcements and desperate men in small boats off the Horn of Africa taking advantage of the chaos everyone else created. It's a story that resists the easy, triumphant framing that a lot of commentary online wants to give it, and it resists the opposite framing too, the one that says none of this progress is real or meaningful. The truth, as it usually does in a live, ongoing conflict, sits in the uncomfortable middle. Genuine military and logistical achievement, real and ongoing human cost, unresolved political questions, and a regime in Tehran that is clearly under serious pressure, but has not yet been forced to change its behavior in any way. It's willing to admit publicly. Whether that pressure eventually produces a negotiated settlement, a further escalation, or a long, grinding stalemate that slowly wears down both economies is not something anyone can honestly predict right now. And anyone telling you with total confidence which of those outcomes is coming is selling you certainty that the situation simply doesn't have to offer. What can be said with confidence is this: the Strait of Hormuz, for 6 months now, has been less a fixed geographic fact and more a contested space being actively fought over, foot by foot and mile, by two sides that each have real reasons to believe they're winning and real reasons to be worried that they're not. That contest is still going on tonight, in the dark, on the water, exactly where it's been going on for weeks. And it's likely to keep going on for a while yet, regardless of which headline you saw first. But there's also a longer historical current running underneath all of this that's worth sitting with for a moment. The Strait of Hormuz has functioned as a geopolitical pressure point for decades, well before this particular war began. During the so-called tanker war of the 1980s, during the first Gulf War, during years of periodic Iranian threats to close the strait in response to sanctions or military pressure, the same basic dynamic has played out again and again. A narrow, unavoidable waterway becomes a lever that a regional power can pull to make the rest of the world feel the consequences of a fight it would otherwise be able to ignore. What makes this round different isn't the underlying leverage. The geography hasn't changed. It's the scale and sophistication of the technology now being used to contest it. Laser-guided rockets, networked sensor fusion between aircraft and warships, long-endurance surveillance drones feeding real-time targeting data, and a financial sanctions apparatus capable of tracking individual vessels by name and flagging their ownership structures halfway around the world. The tools have changed dramatically. The fundamental strategic problem, that a huge share of the planet's energy has to pass through a space 21 miles wide, controlled in part by a government the rest of the world doesn't trust, has not. It's also worth pausing on what this means for the people who aren't part of any military or government at all, the ordinary merchant sailors who crew these tankers for a living. These are, for the most part, not American or Iranian nationals making a political statement. They're crews from the Philippines, India, Eastern Europe, and elsewhere, doing a job that has always carried some inherent risk. Now doing that same job through what is functionally an active war zone, because someone has to move the fuel that keeps economies running. When 4 sailors are reported killed and a dozen more injured over the course of a couple of months, those aren't statistics in a strategic briefing. Those are real people who took a job moving cargo and ended up in the middle of a geopolitical conflict they had no part in starting. The same is true of the crews taken hostage by Somali pirates this week, people caught in the overflow of a conflict happening hundreds of miles away, paying a price that has nothing to do with their own choices. So when you step back from the individual headlines, the rocket costs, the barrel counts, the carrier rotations, the tariff negotiations dressed up as pipeline announcements, what you're left with is a genuinely complicated, still unresolved situation. American military planners have built something real, a functioning defended corridor that keeps meaningful volumes of oil moving despite an active war. That is not nothing, and it deserves to be described accurately rather than either inflated into total victory or dismissed as propaganda. At the same time, the war itself grinds on. The human toll continues to accumulate on multiple sides and among people who never asked to be part of it, and the strategic endgame remains genuinely uncertain. Iran has lost ground by any reasonable reading of the available evidence, but it has not been defeated, and it has not stopped fighting for control of the one piece of geography it has always believed gives it leverage over the rest of the world. What happens next likely depends less on any single dramatic strike or announcement and more on the slow accumulation of pressure, sanctions squeezing Iran's remaining trade relationships, the ongoing military cost of trying to contest a corridor it can no longer reliably see, and the political calculus in Tehran about how much longer this fight can be sustained without triggering exactly the kind of internal unrest that regime has spent years trying to avoid. Whether that pressure produces a genuine shift in Iranian behavior, a negotiated de-escalation, or simply a longer and more expensive stalemate, is the real question hanging over the next phase of this conflict. And it's a question that 6 months of fighting so far has not come close to answering. It's worth spending a little more time on the sanctions side of this story because it's easy to treat it as a footnote to the more visually dramatic naval and air operations, when in reality it may end up mattering just as much, if not more, over the long run. Sanctions campaigns like this one work by attacking the financial and logistical infrastructure that lets a sanctioned economy keep functioning at all. Not just banning direct trade, but going after the specific ships, the specific shell companies, and the specific individuals who make the workaround possible. The December action against roughly 30 Shadow Fleet vessels wasn't just a symbolic gesture. It named individual businessmen, traced ownership chains through multiple front companies, and targeted vessels by their IMO registration numbers, the permanent identification numbers that follow a ship even when its name, flag, and paperwork change. That's a slow, unglamorous kind of pressure built by analysts poring over shipping manifests and corporate registries rather than by pilots flying sorties. But it's exactly the kind of pressure that, over months and years, makes it progressively harder and more expensive for a sanctioned regime to move its product to willing buyers. Every tanker that gets seized, blacklisted, or forced into early retirement is a tanker that has to be replaced, insured through increasingly reluctant underwriters, and crewed by people willing to take on legal and physical risk for the money. That cost compounds. At the same time, it's fair to be skeptical about how much any single round of sanctions actually changes behavior in the short term. Because Iran has been operating under some form of sanctions regime for the better part of 2 decades, and has built an entire shadow economy specifically designed to route around exactly this kind of pressure. The Shadow Fleet itself is proof of that adaptability. It exists precisely because previous rounds of sanctions didn't stop oil exports. They just made the logistics of exporting oil murkier, riskier, and more expensive. So when officials describe a new sanctions push as the toughest in history, that claim deserves the same scrutiny as any other claim made by an interested party in an active conflict. It might genuinely represent an escalation with real teeth. It might also be, in part, a rhetorical flourish meant to project strength to a domestic and international audience, while the actual on-the-ground effect takes months or years to become clear. Both of those things can be true at once, and it will likely take time, not this week's headlines, to know which effect dominates. There's a broader economic angle here too that's easy to lose sight of when the story gets told purely in terms of military hardware and troop movements. Oil is a globally traded commodity, and disruptions to a corridor that historically carried a quarter of the world's seaborne crude don't stay contained to the region where the disruption is happening. They show up in fuel prices in countries that have no direct stake in the underlying conflict at all. They show up in shipping insurance premiums, which have reportedly climbed sharply for any vessel willing to transit the strait, adding real cost to every barrel that does make it through, cost that eventually gets passed down the chain to whoever's filling up a car or heating a home thousands of miles away. They show up in the calculations of major oil-consuming economies like China and India, both of which have historically bought discounted Iranian crude, and now have to weigh the economic benefit of that discount against the increasing legal and reputational risk of doing business with sanctioned Shadow Fleet operators. None of that gets resolved by a single successful convoy of tankers making it through the southern lane on a given night. It's a slower, structural story about how a regional war reshapes global energy markets in ways that persist long after the last shot is fired. It's also worth acknowledging plainly that a war of this length and intensity doesn't happen in a political vacuum back home either. Prolonged deployments, mounting costs, and the kind of grim reporting that's come out about conditions aboard the Abraham Lincoln tend to erode public patience over time, regardless of which side of the political spectrum someone sits on. Reporting from multiple outlets this week described the broader war effort as already facing real skepticism domestically, separate from any debate about whether the military operations themselves have been effective. That's an important thread to keep in view, because military effectiveness and political sustainability are 2 entirely different measures of success, and a campaign can be winning by one standard while steadily losing ground by the other. A years-long open-ended commitment of aircraft carriers, fighter wings, and sanctions enforcement is expensive in dollars, in strain on the people carrying it out, and in political capital, and all 3 of those costs accumulate whether or not the headlines that week happen to be favorable. None of this is meant to flatten the story into simple cynicism either. There's a real defensible case that a patient, layered strategy, combining targeted strikes on specific military infrastructure, a functioning if imperfect naval escort system, and a sanctions regime aimed at the financial plumbing that keeps Iranian oil moving, is a more sustainable and ultimately more effective approach than the alternative of a larger, more direct military confrontation. Wars that end quickly and decisively are rare, and most protracted conflicts over resources or choke points in modern history have been settled, if they were settled at all, through exactly this kind of grinding attrition rather than a single dramatic turning point. Judged against that historical pattern, what's happening in the Strait of Hormuz right now looks less like an anomaly and more like a fairly typical, if unusually well-documented, example of how these situations tend to unfold. Incremental gains, real costs on every side, propaganda from every government involved, and a resolution that, when it eventually comes, will likely look far less clean than any single week's news coverage suggests. What is clear is that the waters of the Strait of Hormuz and the wider region around them will remain one of the most closely watched flashpoints in the world for as long as this war continues, because the stakes there were never really about the strait itself. They were always about who gets to decide the terms on which the rest of the world keeps moving. And 6 months into this fight, that question is still very much unsettled, being answered one convoy, one sanction, and one contested claim at a time. If there's a single takeaway worth carrying away from all of this, it's a habit of mind rather than a conclusion. Treat any single week's claims about who's winning a conflict like this with real caution, no matter which side they come from. Militaries, on every side of every war, have strong incentives to publicize their successes and stay quiet about their setbacks. Governments under sanction have equally strong incentives to project defiance and control, even when the reality on the ground is far shakier. And commentary built for maximum engagement online has its own incentive, separate from either of those, to flatten a genuinely complicated, still unfolding situation into a simple story with a clear hero and a clear loser, because that version travels further and faster than the messier truth. The real picture, the one that actually holds up against the verified reporting, the official figures, and the on-the-record accounts of people who've been tracking this conflict since it began, is neither a triumphant rout nor a stalemate dressed up as defeat. It's a contested, evolving, expensive fight over a 21-mile-wide strip of water that has outsized power over the global economy, being fought with some of the most advanced military technology in the world at a real and ongoing human cost, with an outcome that remains genuinely, honestly undecided. That's a less satisfying story to tell than the version with a clean winner. It also happens to be the one that's actually true, as best as anyone outside the classified briefings can tell right now, and it's the version worth holding on to as this story keeps developing in the days and weeks ahead.